How mining became a geopolitical weapon. It began as a technical necessity, not a strategic asset, a background process designed to secure a network. Few imagined it would one day influence global power dynamics. To understand why mining matters today, we need to look beyond its technical role and see how it quietly intersected with energy, geography, and state interest. Mining was originally framed as a neutral function, computers solving problems to validate transactions and protect the system from manipulation. Anyone could participate. Location seemed irrelevant. Power appeared evenly distributed. That assumption did not survive scale. As networks grew, mining transformed from a hobby into an industry. Specialized hardware replaced general-purpose machines. Energy consumption surged. Profit margins narrowed. Success began to depend less on ideology and more on access to cheap, reliable power. Geography returned to the equation, reshaping what had once appeared borderless. Entire regions emerged as mining hubs, not because of technological leadership, but because of energy policy, surplus capacity, or regulatory blind spots. Electricity prices mattered more than innovation. Political stability mattered more than decentralization ideals. Mining gravitated toward places where costs were lowest and oversight was lightest. This shift changed the nature of security itself. Network protection was no longer abstract. It was tied to physical infrastructure, power plants, supply chains, and national grids. Control over energy translated into influence over validation. Hash power became leverage. At first, this concentration seemed temporary. Market forces would rebalance. New participants would enter. Distribution would normalize. But the opposite happened. Economies of scale entrenched incumbents. Capital barriers rose. Mining power clustered, quietly but decisively. The reveal came slowly. The system was still decentralized in theory, but in practice, security depended on a relatively small number of actors, operated within specific jurisdictions, subject to local policy and geopolitical pressure. Mining had stopped being just computation. It had become strategy. And that transformation was only beginning. As mining consolidated, its economic logic began intersecting with national interests in ways that were impossible to ignore, turning what had once been a neutral technical process into a variable within geopolitical calculations. States that hosted large concentrations of mining infrastructure suddenly found themselves indirectly influencing networks that operated beyond their borders, not by rewriting code, but by shaping the conditions under which that code could continue to run. Energy policy became a lever. Subsidies, pricing controls, and grid access determined who could mine profitably and who could not. In regions with surplus electricity, mining absorbed excess capacity and stabilized demand. In others, it strained infrastructure, raising political concerns about resource allocation. Decisions that once affected only domestic markets now echoed through global digital networks. This entanglement created strategic ambiguity. Governments did not need to explicitly control miners to influence outcomes. They only needed to adjust the environment miners depended on. A regulatory shift in energy tax or a grid restriction could rapidly alter the distribution of hash power across the world. Network security responded instantly, even if users never noticed. At the same time, miners adapted to this reality. Operations became mobile. Hardware was shipped across borders. Facilities were relocated in response to policy signals rather than technological changes. Mining turned into a nomadic industry, constantly seeking jurisdictions where political risk and operational costs aligned favorably. This mobility did not eliminate vulnerability. It redistributed it. Supply chains were specialized hardware concentrated in specific regions. Manufacturing bottlenecks emerged. Export controls, tariffs, and trade disputes suddenly mattered. The supposedly digital backbone of decentralized networks was now exposed to physical and political constraints. As these dependencies accumulated, the idea of mining as purely decentralized security grew harder to defend. Validation power was shaped by forces entirely external to the network. Decisions made in energy ministries and trade offices carried consequences for systems designed to resist centralized influence. The reveal was uncomfortable. Mining had become a bridge between digital autonomy and real-world power structures. It was no longer just about securing blocks. It was about who controlled the conditions under which security could exist at all. And that realization set the stage for a much larger conflict. The conflict intensified when nations began to recognize that mining concentration could translate into strategic leverage, even without direct intervention in network operations. Security, once framed as a mathematical guarantee, now appeared contingent on geopolitical stability, trade relations, and energy access, forces far removed from cryptographic design. Some governments viewed mining as an opportunity. Hosting large operations meant attracting investment, monetizing excess energy, and gaining indirect influence over emerging financial infrastructure. Others saw it as a liability, a drain on resources, a threat to monetary control, or an environmental burden. These opposing interpretations fractured global responses, creating uneven policy landscapes that miners navigated strategically. As jurisdictions diverged, hash power migrated rapidly. Bans in one country triggered surges elsewhere. Networks adjusted automatically, but the transition periods introduced volatility and uncertainty. Security assumptions were tested not by attacks, but by policy shocks. Stability depended on political decisions made with domestic priorities in mind. This dynamic exposed a deeper vulnerability. Decentralized networks had assumed that no single actor would control validation. They had not fully accounted for coordinated influence emerging indirectly through shared dependencies. When energy costs rose globally, when supply chains tightened, or when geopolitical tensions escalated, mining power shifted in ways no protocol update could prevent. Environmental pressure added another layer. Energy-intensive mining became a focal point for criticism, amplifying political incentives to intervene. Climate policy, public opinion, and international agreements began shaping where mining was socially and legally acceptable. Security became entangled with sustainability narratives. The build-up toward the emotional peak centered on realization. A system designed to be immune to borders was now shaped by them. Hash power maps began to resemble geopolitical maps. Control was not absolute, but influence was undeniable. Mining had evolved into something more than infrastructure. It was a bargaining chip, a pressure point, a variable in negotiations far removed from the original vision of decentralized money. And once power becomes strategic, it rarely remains neutral for long. The climax arrived when it became clear that mining could no longer be separated from global power dynamics, no matter how decentralized the underlying code remained. Security was not just a function of mathematics anymore. It was a product of energy markets, political decisions, and international relationships that shifted constantly beneath the surface. This realization forced a reassessment of what decentralization truly meant. A network could be distributed across thousands of machines, yet still be shaped by a handful of energy-rich regions and policy choices made far outside the protocol itself. The architecture resisted control, but it did not escape influence. The resolution lies in understanding this tension, not denying it. Mining did not betray decentralization. It exposed its dependency on the physical world. Every digital system ultimately rests on real infrastructure, and real infrastructure exists within political and economic systems that negotiate power every day. Today, mining sits at the intersection of technology and geopolitics. It absorbs surplus energy, stresses grids, attracts regulation, and shifts in response to policy signals. Its movements offer a map of how digital systems adapt when confronted with state interests, environmental constraints, and global competition. The modern relevance is clear. As societies debate the future of energy, sustainability, and financial sovereignty, mining remains part of that conversation, whether anyone intends or not. It is no longer just about securing transactions. It is about how digital trust is anchored in a world defined by borders. The lesson is not that decentralization failed, but that it is conditional. It depends on resources, incentives, and environments that can never be fully abstracted away. Ignoring those realities does not preserve autonomy. It obscures where influence actually resides. And as digital systems continue to scale, the question becomes sharper. Who controls the foundations when power flows through energy, infrastructure, and policy rather than code alone? So, what do you think? Are we repeating the same mistake again? How